Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning in Europe. So welcome to the third session of the Asia Global Dialogue 2020. I'm Zhiwu Chen, Director of the Asia Global Institute, also the moderator for this session. The topic for this session is recovery, addressing inequality and sustainable development in the post-COVID world. So with us today, we have three panelists. First, our own Asia Global Advisory Board member, distinguished fellow, Dr. Noeleen Heyzer. As many of you know, she served as the Undersecretary General of the United Nations from 2007 to 2015. Then we have our own Advisory Board co-chairman, Nobel Prize in Economics winner, Professor Michael Spence. He's also a former dean of the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Then Jaime Zobel de Ayala, chairman and CEO of the Ayala Corporation in the Philippines. Jaime also sits on many boards of various international and local corporations, as well as social civic organizations. He's also the current chairman of the famous Harvard Business School Asia Pacific Advisory Board. And of course, the more important one is he's a member on our AGI Advisory Board as well. So in some ways, this is our intra-family session to discuss global issues. As I mentioned earlier, the topic for this session is to really address what will happen to the world after the ongoing coronavirus crisis. More specifically, we will try to address the implications for income distribution and many other things after the central banks and the financial ministries of so many governments have taken unprecedented measures to save the economy, save the markets after the coronavirus started. So before all the vaccination is available everywhere, it's time for us to now to talk about after the coronavirus, what happened, what we should do. So maybe let me first invite Professor Mike Spence to start with an opening remark, and then our two other panelists will each have an opportunity to talk for 10 minutes or so. So, Mike.
Thank you, Zhiwu, and it's a great pleasure to be with you again, and with Noeleen and Jaime. So I will try to be brief and cover a fair amount of territory. I tend to think of the pandemic economy as having accelerated a number of trends, and they bear on the subject of our discussion today. The first one, I think, is fairly obvious, is that the center of gravity of the global economy was shifting to Asia. That by itself was an inequality reducing event. That trend has been accelerated in the pandemic economy, essentially because the Asian economies on balance have done a better job of managing the virus and dealing with the trade-off between health and livelihood. And I think there's some residual risk that in the West we'll have more permanent damage because of the inability to get control of the virus. Right now in Europe, we're getting control of the second wave. In the United States, the data say we really haven't turned the corner yet. The pandemic economy has been somewhere between a highly negative and disastrous episode from the point of view of distribution. Domestically, the pandemic economy has required the effective shutdown of a number of sectors in which people in the lower part of the income distribution work. They are on furlough or unemployment or out of work completely. Small businesses have, especially in the hospitality sector, but going well beyond that, are out of business. Studies have been done now about working from home, and it varies enormously by sector. Hospitality, the number is 4% of the jobs can be done from home, whereas in tech or finance, it's over 90%. So you can see, without having a massive amount of data in front of you, that the correlation between being able to sort of keep working and functioning, even though there are difficulties with that, and the income distribution is significant. And internationally, I think we all understand, and there's a recent UN report that this is throwing a large number of people into poverty, and a number of countries in the lower income category, have basically don't have the option of shutting down the economy in order to control the virus, because the livelihood test doesn't get passed for people in the informal population. So from a distributional point of view, we've got a major challenge in reversing these trends. Governments have, to the extent they have had capacity, and that varies across countries, have mitigated these distributional effects through massive fiscal programs designed to buffer the shock and to some extent, shift the damage onto the public sector balance sheet. By and large, I think for most of us, including me, that we believe that was the right choice in a difficult set of conditions. But as Zhiwu mentioned before, it means, among other things, we're probably in for a very long period of low interest rates everywhere this has occurred. And that has distributional and resource allocation implications that we might want to explore later. We're going to have arguably distorted costs of capital, and arguably a situation in which people in the upper end of the wealth distribution, do better. The stock markets have done better than the economies so far. Sustainability, I think, is a slightly brighter picture. I've been impressed with two things. One, progress on sustainability, even in the pandemic economy, and what might have occurred, which is a kind of, well, we don't have time to deal with this, we're in a crisis. On the health front, that hasn't happened. And then when you add to that the likely accession of the Biden administration rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, and a whole lot of commitment and interesting activity in the business sector and so on, I actually think that in terms of both commitment and action, we're in better shape than I might have thought we were going to be. There was some very good news, things like declining costs of solar panels, making solar competitive with coal, and for incremental power consumption or capacity building in much of the world, and so on. That said, this is the final remark on sustainability. We have a major challenge ahead of us. We just had a record-breaking season in the Atlantic hurricane season and in the Pacific typhoon season. We've had wildfires, the likes of which we've never seen before in many parts of the world, including many Western states in the United States. So we've got climate change with us, for sure. And the aggregate data suggests that, we have not turned the corner on carbon dioxide emissions yet. We've got a ways to go. One of the trends that interests me most is the digital acceleration that's occurred. And I think Zhiwu and Noeleen and Jaime and I may want to talk a little bit more detail about that later on. It's been an important element of resilience, but it has complex implications with respect to both inequality and sustainability. And finally, global tensions. Global tensions seem to me to be, with us and rising prior to the pandemic economy. They certainly haven't gone away. There are a few bright spots. I think the scientific and medical community managed to cooperate in spite of these tensions, and so on. So, but the pandemic economy at best has made them slightly more difficult. I think the big test is going to be whether the international community can come together around the vaccine distribution issue. And this is absolutely crucial. if we come out of this, you know, with the wealthier countries and high middle income countries doing fine distributing vaccines, and everybody else is left, you know, at the tail end, you know, that will not be something that passes any test of international cooperation or even ethics. So I think and I worry a little bit about that because I don't see yet evidence of, you know, incisive and aggressive action coming from the international institutions on this front. Zhiwu, back to you.
Thank you, Mike. Well, it's good that you closed with a reference to the vaccine availability thing. Over the last couple of days, I was thinking after reading the news that in the UK, starting tomorrow, they're going to distribute this first vaccine. And then we in Hong Kong, you know, as one of the forgotten places, I think we are left alone. So we wonder whether we will be at the tail end in terms of the distribution calendar or in the middle. But yeah, before we expand to the other points you raised, you mentioned at the beginning the shift, the continuing shift of economic growth or the growth engine to Asia. You think this coronavirus will not stop that, or will only, you think, will only help to accelerate this? Mike, you
I got it, right, I got it. Quick answer is I think it'll modestly accelerate it. I think that the combination of successful management of the virus, relatively speaking, and now this regional economic cooperation agreement that's been signed, you know, it seems to me that trend's probably been given a little more horsepower.
Yeah, just this morning, the new export data out of China is that year over year, last month, it grew by about 22%.
Yeah.
The expectation before the news was 12% growth year over year. So I think yeah, okay, we'll come back to this later.
Well, no, just one comment for your viewers, and they may not know this, but China is the only very large economy that's going to have a positive growth this year, the only one. So,
thank you, Mike. Noeleen.
Yeah, all right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and joy to be with Mike and Jaime. So let me just start by picking up on what some of the points that Mike had already stressed, that the pandemic is more than a health crisis. It is fundamentally a human crisis, and no one is untouched. No economy nor society has been spared, but the most vulnerable communities have suffered the most. So I would like to look at the COVID-19 pandemic, its consequences, our response and recovery from the eyes of the most vulnerable, and really touch on three areas. Who are the most vulnerable, and what does vulnerability look like? Why addressing inequality and social exclusion is at the very core of sustainable recovery, and what does it mean to build back better? So let me just say that the social, economic, and health impacts of the pandemic have actually magnified the inequalities, the insecurities, and the humanitarian challenges worldwide, within and among countries and regions as well. And managing the COVID-19 pandemic, as Mike has said, has forced borders to close, has disrupted our supply chain, destroyed industries and small businesses, and has created vulnerability and joblessness on a scale that has not been seen in peace times. The consequences and impacts are playing out along the lines of inequalities of wealth, of decent jobs, of access to resources, to social protection, the ability to influence decision-making. And the most vulnerable people are the bottom 40%, people who have been living close to poverty line and those who are already very vulnerable. And they are the hardest hit and face greater peril than before on top of the dangers of the pandemics. So as working from home and social distancing are being implemented everywhere as circuit breakers, people who are able to work from home, are they technologically connected? And they are not suffering so much from the disruption. The worst affected are the daily wage workers, the casual workers, the informal sector workers, the migrant workers, and many of whom are actually women. And staying at home and not working is not an option for these poor, many of whom have to live in cramped spaces, and they need to earn daily wages for their own survival. So what does vulnerability look like? Livelihood losses have given rise to dramatic increases to food shortages, to hunger, to eviction and homelessness for people who have no savings and no access to affordable healthcare or social protection. In fact, our bottom billion have no access to social protection even whilst they are working. In other words, they are working in very precarious work. And migrants have lost employment, and their remittances have actually declined, according to World Bank figures, to something like $100 billion US dollars. And the pandemic has not stopped wars or displacement, with disastrous consequences for refugees and undocumented migrants, and making it dangerous or even impossible for many to live because of the mass raids and evictions taking place in so many countries. And I've seen that human trafficking and smuggling are on the rise. So addressing this inequality and social exclusion challenge is at the very core of sustainable recovery. What do I mean? Inequality has not only worsened the impact of the pandemic on vulnerable population, it has also hampered efforts to bring the COVID-19 under control. In fact, what I have seen on the ground is that there are tensions between the local population, the migrants, the undocumented workers, and as well as the refugees. And in fact, I've seen the fracturing of social cohesion and an increase in divisive politics. So what is to be done? Now, coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society approach, a whole of government approach, and whole of the world approach, region by region, that is driven by solidarity. So let me just highlight 3 points or 3 responses for sustainable recovery. First, as Mike has said, we need a large-scale, coordinated, and comprehensive health response. Universal access to health is a critical global public good, and controlling the pandemic is the main prerequisite for a global recovery. So ultimately, we need a COVID-19 vaccine that is affordable, that is safe, effective for everyone and everywhere. And I just want to stress that under the UN umbrella, we have the COVAX initiative, and that 172 countries have already signed up to it. And this is a kind of vaccine multilateralism and cooperation, if you would like. Secondly, I think countries that have done well have actually the ones who have protected their current core capacities, using them wisely to safeguard lives and livelihoods, expanding services to the most vulnerable, keeping households afloat, businesses, sovereigns, supply chains functioning, and institutions and public services strong so that they can deliver. And this, in a sense, helped to rebuild social trust and help to actually heal some of the social divides, as well as maintain whatever social cohesion that is absolutely necessary. Because at the end of the day, it is critical that if we are to recover fully, it has to be a whole of society approach. And I think thirdly, investing in a response recovery process that builds back better is absolutely critical if we want to be able to address the inequalities of all kinds, as well as gaps in our social protection system. And this means basically shifting from the quantity of growth paradigm to the quality of growth, as well as the quality of life development paradigm. So there are 5 priorities for this to take place. I won't touch the one on the digital economy as well as on the green economy, because Mike has touched that, but let me focus on 3 others. First is tackling inequalities should be seen as a new driver of growth. What do I mean? closing development gaps, increasing income security, health security, addressing gender discrimination, ensuring social protection for our bottom billion actually can create new aggregate demand. And by doing so, we are actually increasing consumer demand as well as spending if possible, and that could be a driver of growth. I think the other area that I would like to talk on is actually the need to uphold human rights and good governance practices. And this remains an important bedrock and central to a rule-based multilateral system. Now is the time for political leaders and other influential actors to examine the gaps in state-people governance relations, to be able to leverage community-based organizations to promote inclusion, because sustainable recoveries requires all of society approach. And it is critical that we emphasize the importance of corporate governance to be able to safeguard health and safety of workers at this particular time. And finally, I think the issue of financing, response, and recovery is critical. Mike again has touched this. How a lot of these policy measures will require increases in fiscal expenditure. How to finance them will remain an important challenge. This challenge will be more pronounced for the least developed countries. So we need to bring our financial architecture, our private sector, into the decision-making framework. We need a progressive tax system with fair share of taxation, as well as address issues of tax evasion, as well as tax haven. And I just want to end by saying that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Peace Agreement is actually a shared blueprint for the security of people and for the security of our planet. And it will be remembered as one of the key achievements of contemporary multilateralism, but it could be the framework also for our Build Back Better. But there has been a sliding back of implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda because of COVID-19 and its impact. However, massive investment will be made in developed and developing countries to stimulate recovery. And this is an opportunity to get back on track, to cooperate and organize investments based on the priorities of the Sustainable Development Agenda for a recovery that builds back better. Thank you. Back to you, Zhiwu.
Thank you, Noeleen. This is great. So it's a very comprehensive perspective. Before I turn it over to Jaime, let me just bring up one thing regarding social divide or getting worse as a result of the COVID virus. Let's use the US as an example, especially during the early wave. African Americans got hit particularly. You know, at one point, more than 70% of the COVID-19 related deaths were African Americans. I don't know to what extent that had contributed to the election outcome between African Americans and white Americans and so on. But after the COVID-19 crisis is over, I mean, this divide, this worsened divide, you know, what can American politicians do to really address this? Of course, if the Trump faction would gain more momentum, I guess that divide would continue to widen instead of narrowing. So what do you think, the politicians can actually do to address this?
I think what President-elect Biden has stressed is absolutely critical. He talked about healing the divides, and there is only one enemy at this particular time, and that is not each other, but it is the COVID-19 virus. And what has actually exacerbated the whole situation is, of course, the fact that there are increasing number of people, the lack of a strong directive that is obeyed by all because of the social divides in terms of social distancing, the wearing of masks, and that has created a high increase in the cases of COVID-19 that has actually exacerbated the capacity of the hospitals, exhausted the healthcare workers. So I think that people are seeing this and people want to heal. I mean, there's no other way in moving forward. So I think that we need leadership, critical leadership at this point, where you can articulate things and in a way that touches people's heart and soul, so that they will actually take on some of these responses individually. So of course, there are underlying fractures in society, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and all the divides that I've spoken about. This is the time that we can even start healing them using this process. So let me say that I'm actually hopeful because there are new pathways. So I honestly think that the realization that we can't do this alone or region by region alone without looking at global solidarity and having that leadership. I think the most important thing is really getting global leadership again. We have seen this when our scientists have come together. We've seen this when corporations and governments who share certain common agendas, values, and aspirations have come together. We've seen it in ASEAN, where the ASEAN countries have put away many of their differences and their divides and what they can't agree on to come up with a comprehensive recovery package and strategies for the COVID-19 response and recovery. And I think that that's where the actual challenge is, that this is the time to heal divides. This is a time where we can actually not just build back better, but actually make a major transformation. It is a transformative moment.
Thank you, Noeleen. So now let's move to our very distinguished representative on this panel from the ground. So Jaime, would you like to give your take on this big question, big topic? Mike.
Yeah, absolutely, Zhiwu. Thank you to the AGI for the invitation, and absolutely delighted to be here with Mike and Noeleen. I'll probably just end up building or supporting many of the statements, the excellent statements of Mike and Noeleen, who tackled it from two different angles. But let me just start by agreeing with Mike that the momentum around Asia prior to the pandemic has been phenomenal. We were moving to become 50% of global GDP, by 2050, 40% of global consumption. As Mike said, the trend has been phenomenal. But then as you look at the post-pandemic period, it's mainly the Asian countries in general that seem to be coming out of this relatively well. And if you add the financial component, Asia back in 1997 and 2008, got hit, the banks adjusted, and generally there's some resilience there to financial related issues. Mike made reference to intra-Asia trade. We've seen it on the ground increasing tremendously. What was once going to Europe and the US is now happening in the region. And I think Mike mentioned RCEP, but perhaps, the big player in the room is China. The fact that China has recovered relatively fast and is such a driver of our economies, I think is generally underappreciated in this recovery period. So you move really from these different crises that were pointed out, a financial one, and then a health one, and you really got four interlocking crises. You've got a health crisis, an economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis, as mentioned by Noeleen, and of course an environmental crisis, also mentioned by both Noeleen and Mike. It's extraordinary. We've never seen this influx or conflagration of different forces at play. To go back to Mike's point, Mike, I know you're on the other side of the world, but the Philippines, our pandemic was bookended by two different tragedies. We had Taal volcano just south of Manila at the beginning of the year, and probably the worst typhoon we've ever had at the end. So I take very seriously everything you said, Mike, about environmental issues having to be put in the equation as part and parcel, I guess, of the resiliency solutions in the future. All of us have seen massive drop in revenues across borders. Noeleen's statement about there being no borders when it comes to issues like this has very strong resonance in my eyes. And the issues of job losses, isolation, hunger, sickness refer to many of the things Noeleen is acutely sensitive to from her remarks. Issues of our welfare, our mental state, and the fact that this is a humanitarian crisis, and everything's led to that. Couple of learnings on my end. First, the seismic inadequacies of healthcare systems in countries like ours is phenomenal. Of course, nobody expected the pandemic, but we were generally, countries like ours emerging, healthcare was not a high priority in the equation. And from now on, there has to be a massive move to reallocate capital to upgrading our healthcare industries. And from a private sector perspective, a group like ours, for example, over the last 4 or 5 years has been allocating a lot of capital to that sector only because, where there is a need, of course, there's also an opportunity. So that's the first one, the inadequacies of the healthcare system. And I think both of you have mentioned it is something that has to be revisited in a whole different light. We're lucky in the Philippines that to a certain extent, we have the software, we have great nurses, doctors, in relative to a country like ours, but the hardware is woefully lacking. Second, aside from the traditional brick and mortar solutions, of course, Mike mentioned it, digital solutions, and everything is moving that way in our businesses. This pandemic has made us more digitized than ever before, from our healthcare practices to our banks to our telecom. It's been a great opportunity to jumpstart in a much bigger way many of the digital strategies we had. And I joke around in the office that saying the pandemic did more for the digitization of our group of companies. We're a multi-business group than any speech that I ever gave. But to a certain extent, this whole digitalization that Mike mentioned is a fascinating impetus that's taking place, but very dependent, of course, on the infrastructure. And that lack of infrastructure or existing infrastructure varies by country. And one issue, Mike, on that front is while digitization is a must and everyone's laying out the infrastructure, this technology bifurcation that's taking place between China and the US, I'll let it just hang there. I'm sure you'll be far more intelligent than I am on that issue. But as a provider of telecom services in the Philippines, we've been put in a terrible quandary when we should be bringing costs down, making things ubiquitous, making standards level across the group. We're having to choose. And that's going to take costs up. It's going to create inefficiencies. And I leave that for some discussion. And of course, I think as Noeleen mentioned, this virus has been a massive unequalizer for countries like ours where inequality is already there. It's an issue that has hit home. And I think, Noeleen, it's not going to be at its worst this year. It's just potentially going to get better next year because, there've been savings in people's pockets, or at least some savings. And that's drying up as we move to next year. We've had a particularly hard lockdown in the Philippines. And I wanted to go back to something both of you had said, Noeleen and Mike, which again is another interesting issue, which is the role of government with respect to stimulus. We've seen a range of stimulus around the world. And there's always this tension between a country wanting to keep its credit rating. A country like ours has a credit rating astoundingly these days between Spain and Italy. I mean, when I started working in the Philippines in 1981, we were way off the charts. And here we are. And there's a great deal of pride with our financial managers in maintaining that. So is it the country that must be given importance, or do you use that balance sheet to help people like we do in the private sector when you have a moment of need? So another interesting issue. Issues of education, I think, were brought up. I won't dwell on them. Working from home, financial inclusion, all vital issues. Population segments, older segments, perhaps, Noeleen, maybe that's another area of people becoming, affected. They don't have the capability to handle many of the issues. They can't go out. They're vulnerable and also less comfortable with technology. And of course, you go to the other end of the spectrum, new graduates not getting jobs. MSMEs, a massive component, I guess, of our ecosystem, small and medium-sized industries. They don't have the balance sheet of the big players, and they're very vulnerable at this time. And if time allows, I'm happy to talk a little bit about what we're doing on that line. So bottom line, healthcare issue, digital infrastructure, and all these other new pain points that are beginning to appear. So I'd like to finish supporting Noeleen's statements, which I'm very much in favor of. How do we move forward? And issues of shared prosperity is a new must. This whole issue of of collaborating and sharing and building together, I think is a new language. You mentioned Zhiwu, that I chair the Harvard Business School Asia Advisory Board, and one big discussion I had with them is all of us at business school were taught to compete, whether you're an individual, a company, or a nation state. Competition is the big mantra. How do you gain competitive advantage? But here we have a pandemic where collaboration and cooperation is a must. And I said, some of these models that we were all taught have to be revisited. There are issues that can't be addressed singly. They have to be addressed for a common good jointly. And we've seen a lot of that in the Philippines, and happy to talk a little bit about it. So shared prosperity, collaboration, public-private partnerships, as Noeleen said, and sustainable solutions, what Mike and Noeleen have said. Health, economic, social, humanitarian, environmental, they're all one big bag. They all affect each other. And this whole issue of the responsibility of corporations to look at things more holistically and have a broader role in the development of a country has become very important. I won't go on because I'll allow some time for discussion, but this issue of prosperity, collaboration, sustainability, and our role as private institutions to be part of those solutions rather than distant from it is a whole new game changer in the way we look at things. But thanks, Zhiwu, for the opportunity. I think we have you on mute now.
I'm making that mistake. Okay, now good. Thank you, Jaime, for the great take on the situation from the Asian perspective, and also given such a great summary of what both Mike and Noeleen covered. So now that leaves me without much else to do. But I do want to follow up on one point, one of the points you mentioned regarding Asia versus the rest. Before the COVID-19 crisis, there was so much discussion about the relocation of value chains away from China and to the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries. How much do you think this coronavirus crisis either stopped or changed that relocation movement? Because I think given the trade data out of China today, I think now many more people will be wondering, gee, what about this relocation thing that was much talked about before?
Well, that's very visible. There's definitely a whole revisiting of supply chains. The China-US issue has been a major force at that. There has been certainly a big movement towards Southeast Asia by both even Chinese operators, Japanese, and other people seeking to build up. We ourselves are exporting to China these days, which is unusual. So there's been a big shuffle, but the supply chains are going closer to the customer, Zhiwu, and the consumers fundamentally are in Asia. If you just take it, looking at it in a grand map. And so to a certain extent, even if there is a readjustment in the supply chains, much of that focus I still think will be in our part of the world, because the consumption is really significantly in our part of the world. I don't know how Mike feels about that, but so you'll get a readjustment of these supply chains, which have become far more sophisticated in this day and age. And of course, they're being disrupted in this pandemic. Anything gets disrupted when revenues grind to a halt. But as it begins to pick up again, chances are high that the major component of consumption will be here. And if you look at the statistics, at least the ones that I've read, Asia generally has come out better on the health side. I'm not saying perfectly, but many countries have been examples in our part of the world, China included, Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, in how to handle this, and their engines are starting up again. So if one extrapolates that, although there's some problems, you will see consumption growing ahead of the curve here, and supply chains are going to get closer to the customers, so invariably they'll also come and relocate to this part of the world.
Yeah, thank you. So now let me go back to Mike. Mike has been waiting very patiently. So Mike, you first, can I ask you to unmute? Okay, good. So you touched upon the digital acceleration as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the adoption of digital technologies is at a very unprecedented level. But historically, if we go back starting from the hunter-gatherer era, then to horticultural, societies, and then agrarian societies and so on. It has always been the case that advancements in technologies only made income inequality and wealth inequality worse, rather than flatter and so on. So this accelerated digital adoption everywhere. Will this time be different than the historical patterns or regularities humans experienced? I know you're confident about this change.
Well, first of all, I wasn't waiting patiently. I was listening fascinated to Noeleen and Jaime. So, and I think they made really important points about, the kind of this notion that we've got to come out of this together. It's just a really important set of observations, and changing our mindsets away from, government does all the regulation, we got to compete and that sort of thing. It's just crucial, and it's just wonderful to hear that. Yeah, I think this time could be different because the digital technologies are literally everywhere, and there's a bunch of them that look very inclusive. So take health. There's been use of digital technology to dramatically expand, access to primary care. Sometimes people refer to telemedicine, but the AI-powered digital technologies can do, or be part of a diagnostic process for people who are relatively inaccessible with respect to the medical system as it's currently configured in many countries, especially poor ones. Ditto e-commerce. The studies that I've seen coming out of the Luan Academy in Hangzhou suggest that the e-commerce growth drivers have an important inclusive component. Taobao has 10 million entrepreneurs, half of them are women. The remote cities and rural areas in China seem to benefit more from, access to markets. The average distance between, a small business selling a good and its customer is, like 4 kilometers in the offline world and 1,000 kilometers in the online world. This is, that was the insight that caused Jack Ma to start this. And there's been, there's now, a large number of unicorns in the education space. They've really actually, gone ahead and used digital technology. Now, part of it is, forced by the pandemic, and but it's going to stick around because there's a whole lot of learning about it. And even in traditional education, nobody that I know thinks that, at least for younger kids, that online education is a good substitute for going to school with other kids, but they've learned a whole lot about the use of technology to augment, to complement the traditional methods of instruction and learning. So I think, almost wherever you look, and in finance, I know there's been a glitch in the sort of regulatory structures around Ant Financial and so on, but basically, if you have that much data and the algorithms, you can extend credit to people who are literally anonymous with respect to, the traditional system. So we're not at the end of this. There'll be a lot of experimenting and a few failed experiments. P2P lending didn't go very well in China, but they got a hold of it. Bottom line is there's just a whole lot of inclusive potential in the digital technologies. Now, on the other side, I would just mention 2 things. Automation is a challenge, right? And it's coming. It's part of the reason Jaime said, that the supply chains are going local. And it's not the whole story. The demand side's really important too, as he said. But automation means that people are going to do different kinds of jobs or different mixes of activities in their jobs, and that's a transition and a training challenge that the corporate sector and the educational sector and our government sector and civil society organizations need to face together. So it's another example of public-private partnerships and so on. So digital technology has been and will continue to be a double-edged sword. Finally, well, actually two things. One, some of these benefits will only be achieved if we get our acts together on responsible management of data privacy, data security, and so on. And just asserting privacy is not sufficient because these algorithms require data sharing to work, right? So we got to figure out, what are the principles that are acceptable to people. Now, it may not be the same across countries, but it's a big challenge. It's not just another issue. It's kind of it's the enabling part of using the current version of artificial intelligence responsibly. And lastly, vis-a-vis Jaime's point, I am very worried about these tensions because they do surround technology, and especially they surround digital technology because commercially, in the civilian sector, technologies that were developed, not for national security and military purposes have turned out to be useful there. And so, we've interjected a kind of national security agenda that's very harmful with respect to, distributing these technologies. So I'll close by repeating one thing I said in a meeting last week, and which is globalization has a lot of dimensions, but to me, when you really boil it, we trade in goods and services, capital flows around, people move around to some extent, but to me, the most important part of globalization is the trade in ideas. And the reason is that knowledge is the most powerful growth driver that we've ever discovered. When A gives it to B, both of them have it. We've known this for some time. And so we need a fairly substantial 180-degree change in direction in vis-a-vis the way things are going to make sure that these technologies and the knowledge that's being built, is available essentially everywhere in the world.
Thank you, Mike. So maybe if I understand what you're saying correctly, so there are different implications of digital technologies and other technologies. Some implications are about consumption distribution, consumption inclusiveness. Other technologies may be more important or more impactful on wealth distribution and income distribution. So, as some of my colleagues on the mainland would say, if we compare the air conditioning and other related technologies we enjoy today, every relatively mid-income and higher income people can enjoy, with what Empress Dowager Zhiwu back in the 19th century was able to enjoy. During the summertime, no matter which summer retreat she would go to, it would still be very hot. Whereas today, you don't have to be an empress or an emperor to enjoy special treats during the summertime. Even in Hong Kong, you don't have to suffer from the heat. But I guess we economists and others focus a little bit too much on wealth distribution and income distribution. But I guess the consumption distribution implications may be what policymakers should really focus more on. Because at the end of the day, if everyone's livelihood in terms of material consumption can be lifted by technologies, then what do the new technologies do for people like Jack Ma and so in terms of their new wealth level? Maybe not so important for the larger society to be concerned with. But speaking of technology inclusiveness, so Noeleen, I think my colleague Alejandro Reyes just raised this question about the vaccine rollout. Let me ask you this question based on what he's saying. He says, okay, the vaccine rollout will have to be handled rapidly and equitably, and with significant global collaboration. It will be vital for recovery. What are your concerns about how the vaccine rollout will take place? Because this will have very concrete distributional implications whether we're talking about consumption and survival chances. So who will be the last to enjoy this, and who will be the first? That can have a lot of social and political implications. What is your take on how governments and countries to coordinate and collaborate to handle this?
Thank you for that thoughtful question. I think I would like to put this in even a much larger context of what Mike has just talked about in terms of cyberspace. There's been a lot of misinformation about the vaccine. So not everybody believes that it is going to be effective. And there is a lot of conspiracy theories that are very worrying about this vaccine and who's making profits from it, and is it a conspiracy? It just goes on and on and on. But I hope that our narrative that is science-based and evidence-based will be as strong, if not stronger, than these conspiracy theories, because there is no other way out unless we can have a vaccine diplomacy that is working for everyone. So who and what is going to be a huge distributional effort, and who and what should be prioritized. I think so far people have talked about the healthcare workers. Many of the majority of the healthcare workers happen also to be doctors and nurses, many of whom are women, and also many of the people who are in the who are aging and need it very badly. So I think there is a prioritization, but at the same time, there is also an attempt for public figures to take it publicly so that it creates a kind of confidence about this vaccine. So all this, in a sense, requires a mindset change that is very important. But can I also add on another part to this equation? And this is about gender equality. I wanted to talk about this, but I really feel that this is an important issue, because with any mindset change and what we have seen, we have been forced into the realm of work-life balance. I mean, so far, we always have had to struggle about what does it mean in terms of profitability, in terms of corporate governance, but we have been pushed into life-work balance, and we have also been pushed into the valuing of care work. So far, care work has been very undervalued. And I think that this is a time when we have been able to bring that very much to the framework of what we value and prioritize. And I think the whole transition from the informal to the formal, which is absolutely critical, because the formal allows social protection, where else the informal doesn't. And therefore, if social protection and the social safety net is so important, I mean, that part of the equation, that transition would be very kind of critical. I think, Jaime, you talked about shared prosperity. And I think one of the best way of getting shared prosperity is to close the gender wage gap. And that is something that can be done very easily and very quickly. Mike talked about the kind of digital economy, strengthening women's labor force, especially in higher wage, higher growth sector, in terms of the kind of digital economy, so that they are not always overrepresented in the lowest echelon of the manufacturing sector, of textiles and garments, or the hospitality sector, and so on. I think it's a big way of undertaking this type of major response. And I think the support for women in terms of education, training, in the changing nature of the economy is critical. And here I want to put in a word for youth, because their disrupted education have actually created a problem, as well as the fact that they're looking for jobs in a situation where there is a major situation of joblessness. In fact, the APAC community say that there are about 74 million people who are jobless at this particular time in that community. I think because of the scale of joblessness, many of our youth, unfortunately, have to take on multiplicity of part-time jobs with very little security. And therefore, on top of the fourth industrial revolution and everything else, the situation that they find themselves in is very problematic. And finally, I think having access to decision-making as well as leadership is very critical for both women and youth if they are to input into the type of transformation and decision-making, including the distribution of vaccine. So the creation of new spaces for people's participation is something that I would also stress. Thank you.
Thank you, Noeleen. So now we have about 3 minutes left. I guess we'll probably extend by a few minutes beyond 3 p.m. here. So Jaime, maybe let me ask you very straight about this question that has been waiting in my mind. I'm very curious about. So this year, given the pandemic, what did you do differently for your conglomerate business that you otherwise have not done in terms of new investments and new business priorities as a result of this pandemic?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but bottom line, it's actually building on statements that Mike and Noeleen has stated quite categorically and translating it to a private sector environment. First and foremost, let's go back a little bit in time. The issue of forward planning, Zhiwu, I think people forget when you've got revenues down to zero and the whole country in lockdown, you don't think about the future too much, you think about today. And so the first and foremost, the most important thing was really, we have about 50,000 workers, that's direct workers and employees and executives in our group. First thing was health and financial security. I mean, I focused right away on that and said, how can we expect this organization to work if their health needs and their financial security was not guaranteed? You can't get an organization to do anything. So that was the first thing, and we had to take matters into our own hands. The infrastructure was weak in the Philippines. We had to get involved in importing testing equipment, working with the government to develop testing protocols. Luckily, we have a healthcare group. And so it was just all around that. And once that got stable, and we actually even built hospital facilities for our team, just in case things got filled up in the hospitals. And so that was the first order of the day. The second order of the day was really to work with the ecosystem around us. And just a couple of words on the medium-sized industries. A group like ours, because of the capitalist system, we have about 250,000 small and medium-scale industries around us. And I said, if this grouping doesn't succeed, then our whole ecosystem, everything that modern supply chain management has led to, if that collapses, then your system collapses. So we have worked to unite them into a grouping. We started off by convening them and using digital technology to convene them, started helping educate them with issues that we have access to that they perhaps didn't, issues, healthcare related issues, financial issues, transforming business issues. And now it's moved on from there to working hand in hand with them to address some of their business needs. So it's been a fascinating process. We had never done this before. We just let the system take care of itself. And finally, it really started to move to the ecosystem at large. Aside from our businesses, our analytics group beginning to get a pulse for what was happening on the ground, how customer behavior was changing. We used our relatively new analytics capabilities across our group companies and really transformed them to just focus on how the customer was changing. And now, as we get to the end of the year, we're moving into a proper planning cycle, which we haven't had during the year, and say, now we have all this information. We have information about infrastructure, about the way the consumer is working, about what is needed, about the way our ecosystem is working. Now we can go into a planning. So what's been fascinating, Zhiwu, in a nutshell, is we move from a long-term horizon to a very short-term one, preserving the ecosystem we had, understanding the customer in a new way. And now as we enter 2021, being a lot more intelligent, I believe, or hope, about how we tackle the problem at hand.
Thank you very much. This is really great. So Mike, you have the last word, but let me take this question from my colleague, Casey Kwok, because you advise so many governments. So his question is very suitable for you. With limited resources, governments have a difficult choice between spending more money to help the neediest today and spending more money to invest for a sustainable future. How do you see the what this balance should be, how it should be decided between the two?
You know, I think Jaime and Noeleen may want to comment on this, but it seems to me, first of all, you know, our political leaders have the difficult job of making this choice, right? And it's not easy, right? You know, so I think the simplest thing to say is just that. And secondly, you know, following what Jaime just said, I think you have to take care of people now if you want to have the political and social cohesion left over at the end to pursue longer term goals. You have to solve the short run problem that threatens their lives and livelihoods first. And I think for the most part, our leaders have taken that position.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mike. That's a very good, precise answer. So we're out of time, but let me say that this year, COVID-19 really has shaken up many things, not only for academics, maybe particularly for academics, but also for policymakers and business people, and then civic organization, NGO players. It's really an event that has shaken up our thinking and assumptions about human societies. You know, not to mention what is still happening in the U.S. So this session cannot provide any answer to to all of your questions, but it gives us a lot to think about. So let me thank again Mike, Noeleen, and Jaime for sharing your wisdom and observations. And I have to say also, as the director of AGI, AGI cannot survive without your support. So please continue to come back to this evening's 2 sessions of this year's Asia Global Dialogue. Thank you very much for your participation. Okay, bye now.